Well, good evening, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives, and tonight it's a great honor for me to bring to my show Mr. Mike Billington. I used to play music in the evenings, and one of the things they told you when you first started out was you had to pay your dues. And I tell you, I have got a copy here in my hand of Reflections of an American Political Prisoner, The Repression and Promise of the Larouche Movement, as seen by Michael O. Billington, our guest tonight. And I'll say one thing for Mike Billington: he has paid his dues. And I'm so glad to have the honor of having you here, Mike, and welcome to the show.
Very glad to be here. Thanks.
And Mike Billington, I have spent the last week getting to know you by virtue of your book and the articles that you publish at EIR very regularly. There's a number of them I want to go through tonight with you if we get time. I already know that an hour is going to fly by very fast, and I'm not going to get to hit all of my agenda topics. But the first thing I really do want to do is to just ask you, please, to tell us in your own words how you got to where you're at right now. And that means, where are you from? What's your basic background? And then we need to hear about the arrest and the trial and the imprisonment. And then I think I want to change gears and get back into some more current events that you've been covering.
Okay, that's a lot to cover in a few minutes, but I'll try. I'm from the Midwest. I'm from a Cleveland suburb. Went to school in Hartford at Trinity College, and when I was finishing school was when they had a draft for the Vietnam War, and I had a very high number. I would have been drafted immediately, even out of grad school. And I did not want to go to Vietnam. Not that I was against war particularly, but I considered that war to be an absolute outrage, British-style colonial war. And I joined the Peace Corps, which was just about the only way to not do it. And I stayed in the Peace Corps for 4 years, 2 years in Guyana in South America and 2 years in Thailand. And then when I got out, I was 26 and not eligible for the draft anymore, and came back. And very, very soon after that, looking around at the different political movements, I found Larouche, who was also not against war, but he was against that war. And he was equally against those who said, leave Vietnam to the Vietnamese, get out, get out, get out. And Larouche, from the very beginning, was saying, no, America has a responsibility not to militarily defeat nations, but to help them build, to do what we now think of as the Belt and Road or the New Silk Road. And that was his policy from the beginning, that America would not survive itself if it did not participate in developing the world with American system methods, American systems as they were known originally by our founding fathers: infrastructure, development, technology, education, health, and so forth. So I very much supported that, got involved deeply, and that was 1971, and I've been involved ever since. So that's now 50 years. That's a long time. And I won't go through all the things I did in the organization, but I did take a lot of interest in Asia, having been there. When I was one of the lead people targeted in the Robert Miller DOJ Get Larouche Task Force, as it was known, when Henry Kissinger recognized that Larouche was having a profound influence on Ronald Reagan in terms of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was Larouche's idea. He'd organized that for around the world for many years, and convinced Reagan that this was the right approach, to work with the Russians to develop anti-missile defense systems rather than Kissinger and the British mutual assured destruction idea that we can blow each other up and therefore there won't be a war. And he said, no, we need to work together. The world has to come together around development, not sit there with your guns pointed at each other. So that's what turned Kissinger and company against us. They mobilized the Justice Department and Robert Miller, the same Miller who ran the investigation of Trump's Russiagate, Russia connections, the same fraud. And to a certain extent, it was for the same reason, because Larouche was, in fact, a back channel connection to the Russians from Ronald Reagan, proposing collaboration on space-based anti-missile defense systems. So that led then to our being targeted. I was targeted somewhat more than others because I also, as one of the fundraisers for the organization, had been very close to a very wealthy woman who was also being targeted by Oliver North and their friends to get money to run guns to the Contras in exchange for the drugs that we now know was going on in that operation. And so Oliver North had a certain hand in making sure I was particularly targeted, and ended up in 2 trials, a federal and a state trial, for the non-existing crime of opposing the oligarchical system that was taking over the United States. The accusations were that we were borrowing money with no intention to repay it, and they literally passed a law after we were indicted, saying that our loans were securities and that we were selling securities without a pass, without a license. Pretty absurd. And then I was given a double jeopardy case, once in the federal courts and once in the state courts. So I ended up with 77-year sentence in the state of Virginia. And that turned me into something of a figure around the world. You know, the fact that for borrowing a few tens of thousands of dollars, that warranted 77 years in prison, compared to the millions being ripped off on Wall Street for people that got nothing at all. And so in that sense, I became sort of a well-known figure, along with Lyndon LaRouche, who was the main target. We were all in the crossfire, sort of. But LaRouche spent 5 years in prison. And during that time, it was 10 years altogether I was in prison, but in a certain sense, it was the best years of my life. I was free of other responsibilities and really dug into studying both American and European philosophy, culture, science, but also especially Asian and especially China, and did comparative studies of Confucian and Christian renaissances and ideas. Spent 10 years in prison, and then I got out, and here I am.
Wow. And it's an amazing story. Now, can I just get you to do one thing for me? Because it's been a long time since SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Would you give me a little bit of an idea of how it was that Lyndon LaRouche was in a position to talk to Ronald Reagan? And was Reagan, a science-minded person that would be able to see the genius of this plan? Or I'm trying to put myself in that time and to think of, well, yes, everybody heard of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Very few people ever heard of LaRouche, and those that did usually got some propaganda that was unfavorable. That's my recollection. So the Strategic Defense Initiative was a real scientific idea that Lyndon LaRouche had, and was able to somehow convince President Reagan to do it. And then the intelligence community didn't want that to be done. Just remind us a little bit more about it.
We mobilized for several years around the world for this idea, to do away with MAD, M-A-D, mutual assured destruction. That was a guaranteed war. The argument for MAD by Kissinger and his British friends was that this would prevent war, because nobody would go to war if they could be blown up themselves. Well, that's fine, but it's a fixed way of keeping the world divided. Under MAD, you could never bring the world together around the common aims of mankind, because supposedly we were divided between these two irreconcilable East versus West and so forth. It was a scheme, a typical imperial divide and conquer scheme. And it allowed colonial wars to go on unabated. They could go ahead and launch wars in Africa and Asia. They dragged the United States into that despicable Vietnamese War, which was a colonial war. And they weren't worried that it would escalate to a nuclear war because mutual assured destruction. So they could continue their colonial and neo-colonial policies across Africa, South America, and Asia, safe from the danger that there would be a nuclear war. Well, that's nuts. That's British imperial lunacy. And Larouche, we organized conferences all over Europe and Japan and Asia and South America, mobilizing around the idea of a what we called mutual assured defense through pushing forward on the frontiers of human knowledge, developing laser beam, particle beam type weapon systems that could knock out incoming missiles, knock out a missile from any rogue nation, and mutually work with the Russians especially, but all nations, on as a science driver, the way the space program was a science driver under Kennedy for collaborating worldwide on advancing human knowledge and the application of that knowledge to the economy. So in the 1980 election, Larouche was running in the Democratic primary. Reagan was running in the Republican primary, with George Bush the expected winner of that primary. We played a major role in exposing Bush and his Trilateral Commission people as essentially assets of British imperial thinking. And when Lyndon LaRouche and Reagan ended up in the same debates, they had extremely fruitful discussions. LaRouche proposed this idea, got him the material. At one point, quite interestingly, Reagan was asked during that campaign if they shouldn't do away with the minor candidates. And he said, no, minor candidates play a very important role. Look at Lyndon LaRouche. He knows he's not going to win the election, but he's using the election to bring new ideas to the American people. And that was sort of the key that the Kissingerians and the Wall Street boys said, uh-oh, we're in trouble with Reagan. We better be careful. He's listening to LaRouche. And then as soon as Reagan came into office, he asked Lynn to be a back channel contact with the Russians to bring up this idea, to see if they were willing to work together. I won't go through the details, but under Andropov, who was running the Soviet Union at the time and was basically a British asset, they said, no, we're not going to work with you. We're confident that the Democrats will defeat this idea of a strategic defense initiative. And unfortunately, they did, and some Republicans. And so the idea was never really developed, unfortunately. But that was the basis on which we reached that collaboration. And we were pushing to make that collaboration go further, to take on the international drug cartels, which we knew were at the center of global finance, the biggest business in the world. Reagan was interested in this. And then a series of things where we were prosecuted, subjected to wild media slanders, TV, radio slanders, and so forth. And they generally were able to break that connection. And then, of course, Reagan got sick and things went downhill from there, and you ended up with the Bush family in charge.
Well, the president got shot. And I have to think that had something that fit into this timeline somewhere. Did it not affect the way he was able to interact with Mr. LaRouche, for instance?
It definitely did, and you probably know that Hinckley was a close friend of the Bush family.
It's something that people just still, they don't believe it. You could say it, and then just they forget about it. But yeah, that was a Neil Mallon connection, I think. Anyway, yeah, the Hinckley to one of the brothers, Bush brothers, was a close friend.
Right.
Anyway, thank you for that. And yes, so Lyndon LaRouche was very, very close to the president at the time, and the Bushies didn't like that. Kissinger, of course, and Oliver North came down very hard on you personally for your personal attempts to maybe get some money where he thought it was his, he thought that was his cash cow, and you went and tried to tap his mind there, but 77 years they're sending a chilling message to anybody that wants to follow in your footsteps, and in your way, have conquered that. You're doing great work right now, and let's turn to right now, because in Alaska, right, there's a some type of a diplomatic conference going on between the United States and China, and the report of it was, that well, why don't we try diplomacy? And well, you can't talk to these people. We're not going to talk to these people. It sounded just like John Foster Dulles in the beginning of the Cold War, saying you're either with us or against us, and you can't talk to them. You cannot use diplomacy. It's like diplomacy is the one thing that you can't do. So the upshot, obviously, is the war goes on, which makes them all happy. So what do you think it's going to take? I have been fascinated with Richard Black's reporting last week, and Paul Gallagher, and a number of the articles that I'm reading that give me the hope that China really is not the evil bear that we're told that it is, and that it really might be something that we can, if there's willingness in America to do the diplomatic thing, that we could actually cause peace to happen in a huge swath of the world. It just looks like it requires a little bit of willingness on our part, from what I've been told. You're an expert in this field, so tell us a little bit about what's going on between the U.S. and China, and where do we find some hope, and how do we look towards a positive future?
Yeah. Well, let me say that the video you're showing now, I really encourage all of your listeners to listen to the full hour plus of this, both the despicable, evil statements coming out of both Blinken and Sullivan. We're the strong ones. We know the truth. You are evil. Everybody in the world knows how evil you are. Now, it's such a blatant lie. But also listen to Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. They were quite angry, and they were very outspoken. And they made clear that nation, which is accusing China of aggression and coercion, is a nation which has sanctions against dozens and dozens of countries all over the world, who have massively destroyed several nations that were no enemies of ours, who were anti-terror, Iraq and Libya and Syria, and left these countries in total disaster. Iraq has never been rebuilt after we, quote, won the war. We have destroyed these nations on purpose. It was intentional. We have adopted under Bush and then under Obama the British imperial policy, which was that the developing sector nations are only good for one thing, which is raw materials. Keep them backwards so we can get them cheap, and we can use some of their cheap labor. But these are not human beings in our sense. Prince Philip and now his son, Prince Charles, who have run this despicable Green New Deal operation, have said over and over again, Prince Philip said, the only big problem in the world is overpopulation. I hope to be reborn, reincarnated when I die as a deadly virus to help solve the overpopulation problem. This is the thinking of this British imperial crowd and their assets in the United States. So what's the real story in China? I mean, China was obviously struggling terribly. They went through a period, so-called Cultural Revolution at the end of the Maoist era, in which they were taken over by really evil people. And they had a period which the Chinese people look at the way Germans look at the Nazi era, as a nightmare, an absolute despicable nightmare. But coming out of that with Deng Xiaoping, they began to open up to the rest of the world. They sent tens of thousands of their young people to the US, to Australia, to Russia, to Germany, to get educated and to learn what it was that had led to the development in the West, to master, in a sense, the American system. And they began to grow, they began to develop. By the time the Soviet Union fell in the early 90s, Lyndon Larouche and Helga Zepp Larouche, his wife, said, now, this is the time to end this British imperial divide, East versus West, once and for all. And the way to do it is to build the new Silk Road, to do what Leibniz wanted to do when he represented the greatest era of the Western Renaissance and reached out to the Chinese and said, these two great cultures at either side of Eurasia, when in reaching out to each other, they will bring all of humanity up. And that's exactly what Lynn and Helga proposed with the new Silk Road. We took it to our European friends and they said, forget it. We're going to keep Russia as an enemy. We need an enemy image. We're going to move NATO right up to their border. We went to the Russians. They were being looted under Yeltsin, that period, after they fell. The country was, the Western the crowd came in and just stole everything they could. The country was a disaster. They couldn't do anything. But we went to the Chinese and they said, phenomenal, fantastic. This is the right idea. And Mrs. Larouche is still known as the Silk Road lady in China when we traveled through China. And they adopted it. It took a while. This was the 90s. You remember what happened at the end of the 90s. There was the so-called Asian crisis, and there was a beginning of the breakdown of the Western financial system, really. So things didn't move quickly. But by the time Xi Jinping came in 2012, he adopted it fully. He began to do it. And by this time, China had achieved the greatest economic miracle in the history of the human race. They began from terribly backward conditions and unleashed the greatest scientific technological development process mankind has ever seen. And as you know, over the next 30 years, they lifted 800 million people out of poverty. This year, they ended abject poverty in China, the biggest country in the world, and it's never been done in history. How did they do it? With Social Security or with social handouts and welfare? Quite the opposite. They did it the way Alexander Hamilton did it, is that they launched massive infrastructure programs all over the country. High-speed rail, new ports, beautiful bridges, educational systems, hospital systems, all over the country. They made a bit of a mistake by starting off just in the coast, and that led to the crisis in 1989. Many people remember the so-called Tiananmen Square situation because they had somewhat ignored the interior. But they learned from that and unleashed massive development into the interior, taking this science and technology. That's when they built this massive 50,000, it's going to be 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. We don't have a single kilometer here in the United States. And they did this by the time they decided to launch the Belt and Road, where the idea, what they called the new Silk Road at first, or the One Belt, One Road, that's how it came to be called the Belt and Road. But the idea was to take this method to the rest of the world, to help the Africans and the Asians and the South Americans to break out of the colonial looting that they had suffered both under the colonial era and the neo-colonial era under the dictatorship of the IMF and the World Bank, where they were told your state of development it's not appropriate to have big projects like dams and railroads. That's not appropriate for your level, but we'll get you really modern picks and shovels and help you get your tiny little crop to market. And the Chinese came in and they said, no, we've learned that the key thing that blocks development and breaking out of poverty is infrastructure. Now, China has a very different political system from the United States. There's no question. And that's an interesting thing to discuss. But the Chinese are now applying the American system of economics, whereas we in America are not. We have accepted, especially since the killing of John F. Kennedy, we have accepted the British model. They call it the independence of the Fed, the freedom of Wall Street to do what they want. When Hamilton said, no, the elected government has to run the economy, not the private bankers, and they have to run it for the general welfare. And the Chinese have adopted that. It's not foreign to the Chinese, actually, because people have heard of Sun Yat-sen, and I think Richard Black discussed that on your program. Sun Yat-sen was trained by the Lincoln School when he was in Hawaii, And he went back and ran a revolution based on what he called the three principles of the people, which were, in fact, Lincoln's government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so that idea was there. The communists that emerged, there were two factions. There was a faction that was more oriented towards anti-Western thinking, and there was another faction around the Sun Yat-sen group and others in that circle, which included Zhou Enlai, who was one of the top advisors to Mao, but who represented the commitment to science and technology in what's really called the American system. So the irony today is that, you hear this ranting and raving about the Communist Party dictatorship and genocide against the Uyghurs and oppression of their people. The Chinese people are very happy that they are part of the greatest explosion of scientific and technological development in the history of the human race, where their children are taught Western classical music at a rate dozens of times more than our children who were denied access to real classical beauty. And that is what China is doing with the Belt and Road. They're taking this out to the rest of the world to help them escape from poverty. This is what is called by people like Pompeo and unfortunately also Blinken as oppression of aggression. They're trying to take over these countries by building things, by building schools and hospitals and trains. The head of the Southern Command in the Congress last week literally said that China is using vaccine diplomacy to destroy the sovereignty of the countries of South America. Now you have to think about what a twisted idea that was. Destroying their sovereignty by keeping them alive with vaccines that have been denied by the US, who is hoarding its vaccines. This is the kind of twisted thinking which is like what we like to quote Bertrand Russell, who said that if you get them young enough, you can convince them that snow is black.
I didn't hear that one, but a lot of Bertrand Russell is black to me.
Yeah, indeed.
A very dark view of mankind. And well, let's turn to another subject that may be a little more fun. You wrote an article recently about Harry and Meghan, and I wonder if you want to tell us a little bit about what's going on there. But personally, they know Oprah and all this stuff. I see it's happening, but I don't pay attention to it. But there's something there. Please tell us more.
Well, I don't have great respect for Harry or Meghan, but the fact that they did go on TV and they identified the dysfunctional nature of the royal family, and in particular went after the racism of the royal family. And people, everybody watches this stuff, so they know what happened. What I wrote in the article, and which I encourage people to read, it's in the current issue of EIR, is that this reminds us of when Princess Diana went on BBC in the 90s and said her husband was dysfunctional. This is a dysfunctional family. It's a racist family that was doing evil across Africa. And this, of course, blew up the royal family. And then later, when she had the gall to have an affair with a non-white Egyptian, I think that was the final straw and they had her killed. But at the time, what people don't know is that Lyndon LaRouche and our EIR had published a thing in 1994 called The Coming Fall of the House of Windsor. And in the introduction, which we reprint in the EIR this week, Lyndon LaRouche really identified the fact that Prince Philip, the founder of the World Wildlife Foundation, there you go, nice picture, which was a institution created in order to depopulate the world, and which is now expressed in the so-called Green New Deal. But that Prince Philip, LaRouche said, was already guilty of killing more people, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, than Hitler ever dreamed of. And that if he got his way, it would be worse than just genocide against the developing sector, because it would also mean what we're now seeing in the Green New Deal as an intentional takedown of industry, a takedown of modern agriculture, and a general imposition of depopulation as a policy by destroying science, destroying technology, destroying energy. And this was already in play in that time, in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And we identified that in 1994. And one of our associates sent that report to the royal family, to all the members. And we know from sources that it caused consternation. But Princess Diana wrote back and said, "Thank you so much for this information. This means so much to me." And we kept a dialogue going with Lady Di for several years. She continued to be extremely grateful for our giving, putting in the context of history and of the long-term question of the human race as a whole, what the British imperial family really was, as the drug peddling, genocide-minded degenerate that they always had been and were still, or almost always had been. So when she was killed, this had a great deal to do with us. We actually got engaged in the investigation into the assassination. We were actually taken on to BBC. Even Lyndon Larouche was allowed on to BBC to discuss this. And immediately, the government and the royal family cracked down on BBC, fired the director and most of his key staff for the crime of having had allowed Larouche to come on and tell the truth. I mean, talk about censorship against by Twitter and Facebook. That one was taking down the entire leadership of BBC for the crime of allowing the truth to escape through the Larouche organization. So it's worth checking that. And I think, you know, what Meghan did, she's a problematic character, but I admire the fact that she had the courage to let this out. And hopefully it'll provoke the right kind of debate. We'll have a great deal of discussion on this tomorrow. Oh, I haven't mentioned, I hope everybody knows that we have a 2-day conference that starts tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock Eastern time. And it's strongly advised that all of you sign up and watch. It's 2 sessions Saturday and 2 sessions Sunday. I won't go through it all right now, but it's going to be, if you think about the fact that the Russians and the Chinese are being denounced, we refuse to talk to you, you're evil people, you're aggressive. The only forum in the world right now for leaders of nations to come together and to discuss what we must do to prevent World War III, to prevent this economic holocaust, and to bring the world together is this organization tomorrow and Sunday, where we will have top representatives from China, from Russia, from Syria, from Yemen, from all over South America, all over Europe and the United States, key people from Africa. This is the forum for humanity's hope for the future. That's what the LaRouche organization always has been, and now it's increasingly recognized as that by people of goodwill around the world. So I encourage you to be sure to watch tomorrow and Sunday.
And the website name is LaRouche Organization?
I believe it'll also be on the LaRouche organization, but it'll definitely be on the SchillerInstitute.com. This conference is sponsored by the Schiller Institute, which is our international body.
And what time is that again tomorrow?
10 o'clock both Saturday and Sunday.
Excellent.
2 sessions. It'll go till 5.
Okay. Well, I'll be planning to join you, and that sounds exciting. And well, let me get back to China for a second, because in response to some of the comments of Richard Black and others last week, got a lot of kind of pushback stuff. Like, you know, for instance, PBS did a reply to the claim saying, no, that they didn't conquer poverty, you know, and then there's other articles in different places that are saying, no, this is not true. You are telling us that they absolutely have gotten rid of at least the abject worst level of poverty, but a lot of people just find that hard to believe. I've still, when I think of Peking, the first thing that comes to my mind is that that awful brown smog that we used to see on television. That they would say that, you know, and you get a picture of a world that's kind of grungy and dirty and not all that pleasant. I'm just giving this out to you as a devil's advocate to kind of summarize some of the feelings that I get in response to all the positiveness that you folks at Larouche and Schiller Institute are projecting.
Well, they have a serious pollution problem, real pollution, not carbon, pollution. They built very, very fast, very quickly. There's also a whole long story about the area around Beijing where the dust from the Laos plain would come in and get trapped by the mountains that surround Beijing. So it's not just pollution, but the geography of the place is very difficult, and they're working on that. The reason they're going along with this crazy carbon garbage, as if carbon has anything to do with the climate, which it doesn't, is because they do have to fight real pollution. It was like Trump. Remember, Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord. It was the best thing he did. Said it was nonsense. He hired a guy named Will Happer, the head of the physics department at Princeton, who, by the way, is speaking at our conference tomorrow. Trump brought him onto the National Security Council with the intention of Will Happer, who started a national organization called the CO2 Coalition, to set up an actual debate on this garbage about man-made climate change, about anthropogenic climate change. And he was going to have a debate with the greenies with real science. And the same military crowd that surrounded Trump, who refused to follow his orders as commander-in-chief to get the hell out of Syria, get the hell out of Afghanistan, stop these crazy, endless colonial wars. The military refused to do so, and they also refused to allow a debate on real science. So Will Happer stuck around for a year trying to get the debate, and finally he resigned and went back to Princeton. So he's going to speak tomorrow. Another reason for you to be on that first panel, or second panel, I think, second panel tomorrow. So the question of, what we have seen in this anti-China hysteria, it was launched before Trump came in. But when Trump came in and said, we should be friends with Russia and we should be friends with China, and he invited Xi Jinping to Mar-a-Lago, they had a wonderful meeting. He then went to Beijing and was taken on a personal tour by Xi Jinping through the Forbidden City. He came back saying, this is a great country and a great leader. And those were fighting words in the city of London and Wall Street. We can't let this happen. This guy's got to go. And we published that pamphlet, if you want to put it up. We published a pamphlet in 2019 called End the McCarthyite Witch Hunt Against China and President Trump. And people have to recognize that. This anti-China stuff from Pompeo, from Christopher Wray at the FBI, who went around, and still is, going around the country arresting Chinese and Chinese Americans who are the leading scientists in the world, and they're being arrested and charged with the crime of sharing cancer research with the Chinese. Don't get me started on that. I get furious. There's an article in the EIR magazine that I wrote on this issue too, and I encourage you to read it, because finally some professors at Harvard and MIT are fighting back against this atrocity. But this was an attack on Trump. It was to make him stop saying we should be friends with Russia and China. And all the media, including Fox, which pretended it was defending Trump, but how did they defend Trump? They said, well, Russia really is evil, but Trump wasn't manipulated by Russia. And now, of course, they're just as vile in terms of attacking China as this monster. What do they really hate about China? Because China is going to the rest of the world and saying, you don't have to be slaves to the IMF system anymore. We will help you by building your real economy. We're not just going to load up debt the way the West did. We're going to build things so that you have physical productive power in your country. That is what they hate. This is destroying the British imperial system, which unfortunately America has become slave to. And that means they have to figure out how to destroy Russia and China. And it's not Democrat or Republican. We now see that even though Biden came in, and Biden, Biden is is an early senility. He's not a very cogent person. I think that's why they put him in. The one cogent thing that Biden has done was that he had a 2-hour phone call with Xi Jinping. And in that call, they set up this meeting that's taking place in Alaska. But the basis was, let's collaborate. Let's figure out our differences, but let's work together on things we should be working on. And this is what Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi had to say today. Let's work together on economic development in the world, instead of attacking us for developing the third world. Let's work together to do it. And Biden came out of that 2-hour call and he briefed the press and he said, I don't want to go back to the Cold War. I don't want 2 blocks where we're threatening each other. We need to figure out a way to work together. And he repeated these pseudo complaints about Hong Kong and Xinjiang and so forth, but he just repeated them. But that's not what Blinken is doing. So we're back to the same thing. The one cogent thing that this pathetic president who doesn't, it's sad that they put this guy in his state of mind in the presidency with Kamala Harris guiding him around. And his wife stepping in to speak for him when he can't put a sentence together. It's sad. But the one cogent thing he did is they're not accepting it. They're doing exactly what Pompeo and these people did with Trump and the China and Russia issue. And keep in mind, Trump openly, strongly supported China and Xi Jinping until the coronavirus hit, and he was convinced that he had to blame somebody because we were unprepared. At the beginning of the virus last year, Trump said, the problem is that our cupboard is bare. Our medical system has been taken down. We don't have the means to produce the tests and the masks. And we had to import them. And the Chinese sent them to us, as a matter of fact. But he was telling the truth at first. But then it was clear he had not handled this the way the Chinese did, which were able to snuff it quickly by moving quickly. And he needed somebody to blame, and they convinced him to start attacking China. But he never repeated the lies from Pompeo about China being aggressive and human rights violations. Trump never said those things. Those people who think they support Trump and that Trump was anti-China, he had one problem with China, which was the trade deficit. And he was doing a good job to resolve that. They had a very successful trade negotiation. But otherwise, he was totally an admirer of the great Chinese culture, the 5,000-year culture, and Xi Jinping is a great leader who was developing his country, supporting his people. Keep in mind, when they scream about human rights, right? What's the most important human right? What did Franklin Roosevelt say the most important human rights were? Freedom from want, freedom from poverty. Look at our country and compare that to what's happening in China today.
Well, that's what I'd like to do. I really would, because we have terrible pockets of poverty in this country that are never talked about. And this terrible suffering goes on by families, usually the elder parents of people that might have been killed in a war or otherwise sidetracked in life by the vicissitudes that are thrown at us by these people, all part of the general idea of degrading us and depopulating, as has been said. It's a terrible thing that we have so many people that are unaware that we really are at war. We're fighting for our very survival as independent animals on the planet, and that this is all tied together in so many ways. I do want you to tell us about Dr. Lieber, because Dr. Lieber was very famous, a year or so ago, and was kind of held up as an example of bad China. Tell us the truth about Dr. Lieber and why he was prosecuted.
Dr. Lieber is still actually the head of the chemistry department at Harvard. He is the world's leading scientific expert on nanotechnology, which is applied in every area of science and technology. It's, the manipulation of atoms and things in order to be able to actually get in there and change things the way they work, and then applying it to medicine and technology and industry and everything else. A brilliant guy. In January of 2020, he was arrested by Christopher Wray, this lunatic whom, unfortunately, Biden kept on as head of the FBI. This guy who was running a McCarthyite witch hunt. This stuff makes McCarthy look good by comparison. Every university was told they had to spy on any Chinese or even Chinese Americans who were professors or students. They're all spies. Their Confucius Institutes are there to spy and poison the minds of our youth to make them think there's something good in China. That's practically a quote from Pompeo. Something good from China. They're brainwashing our children by teaching them Chinese and Chinese culture. So, you know, as one of the Chinese leaders said to I think it was to Pompeo, actually, I forget who, but he said, is your culture and your society so weak that simply hearing about another nation is going to undermine it and destroy it? Which is a clever way of putting it. But this Lieber was arrested. He's dying of pancreatic cancer, by the way, and he's fighting this. This was a year and 2 months ago, and it took this long. It took until March 1st for finally the rest of the Harvard professors to come up and stand up and fight. But thank God they did. They finally put together a list of 42 leading professors from Harvard and other places. 6 of them are Nobel Prize winning scientists who said this attack on Lieber is an attack on science. This is an attack on the way we collaborate with scientists around the world to advance human knowledge. That's what's under attack by this criminal DOJ witch hunt, McCarthyite witch hunt. And people have sat back and accepted it. In fact, you know, the anti-China sentiment has sunk in. As you said, people say, oh, China's this and China's that. They have no idea. Why don't they go visit China? It's wide open. You know, the Chinese ambassador to the UN yesterday, a couple of days ago, when the issue of Xinjiang came up, and what about the genocide in Xinjiang? And, you know, the Chinese tell the truth. Yeah, they dealt with terrorism in Xinjiang in a very different way than Bush and Obama did. Bush and Obama and Tony Blair and the British, their solution to terrorism was to go bomb back to the Stone Age those countries that were anti-terror, Iraq and Libya and Syria, driving millions of people out of their home, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people. How did the Chinese do it? Well, they took on the terrorist crowd that had been trained, by the way, in Syria and in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But they took them on. They did arrest and several hundred terrorists, right? But then the young people who were being inundated with this radical Islamic ideology in the mosques, they said, look, we're not going to bomb you. We're not going to kill everybody in your family. We're going to educate you. We're going to give you training in technologies and vocational skills that you can use as jobs, while we are building up the entirety of Xinjiang into one of the fastest growing regions in the entire world, creating millions of jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs, new jobs. We're taking the people who were living in backward areas in the mountains where there was no way to be prosperous or even get out of poverty. They built new cities. There's more mosques per capita in Xinjiang than any other country in the world. That's how they're killing. The Uyghurs have doubled in population in the last 20 years. It's a funny kind of genocide, isn't it? So they don't kill the people. They train them, they educate them, they get jobs for them. Of course, Pompeo said, oh, this is forced labor, slave labor. But anyway, this ambassador to the UN said, look, come to Xinjiang. It's open. Visit. Come see it. There's no secrets here. And I encourage all of your listeners, anybody who says, wait a minute, China's horrible, go to China. You have a responsibility to the human race to go to China and find out how this British imperial McCarthyite witch hunt has been used to try to convince people that snow is black.
Yeah, convince people that, 2 and 2 is 5, or whatever is required under, great leaders' latest pronouncements. I was thinking of re-education camps myself when I was just after January 6th, when they decided to do a dragnet of people that went to the mall on January 6th. A lot of people went down there just because they wanted to see if they were going to have a hearing on these questions of fraud in the election. And, people like AOC, the representative from New York, was talking about re-education camps. And if you supported President Trump, you must be crazy. So we're going to have to re-educate you. And it just sounds so chilling. And I really do feel like we're in danger of this totalitarianism here in this country. If it's getting better in China, that might not even make any difference here if the Iron Curtain, so to speak, comes down on us, or the big dragnet from the sky comes down, and we're all in dossiers and getting monitored by the equivalent of the Stasi.
Yeah. Well, now that you've got this incredible censorship going on here, which you know, and everybody knows, they can censor the president of the United States. They try to build an alternative platform and they take it down because Amazon and these tech run the platforms. I mean, this is an amazing level of censorship. The First Amendment is gone in this country. Unless you say what they want to hear, you can be absolutely censored throughout the country. And, one other thing on China. Now, it's true that China long ago would not allow Facebook and or Twitter. They have their own versions that the Chinese people use, social media. But they blocked out Facebook and a lot of the media. A lot of the pornography is not allowed in China. There's a very good joke that Richard Black told me, actually, that you had on before. He said, somebody came up to me and said, "How can you support China? It's a vicious dictatorship." And he said, "Yeah, it's a real dictatorship. Why? Do you know in China, kids have to do their homework? God, isn't that outrageous? They're not allowed to watch pornography or smoke marijuana. What a vicious, we have to bring freedom to those people." So, I mean, this is a joke, but it's true. What are we going to do in this country about the cultural disaster that we're living through? A culture where kids have no access to beauty. They don't teach classical music or poetry in the schools anymore. They don't teach anything that has any beauty in it. They're taught to love ugly noise that they call popular music. The so-called entertainment, the movies and so forth, are mostly pornography and violence and perversity. I mean, we have a cultural disaster in this country. Drugs are promoted. Obama legalized drugs. You can't legalize something that destroys the mind. This is a cultural decay and collapse which has to be resolved if we are going to solve the economic and strategic problems. We have to get at the question of the fact that people have been denied the right to develop the creative powers of their mind. And the first session in our conference tomorrow is on the cultural disaster. We'll address Dante. This is the 700th anniversary of Dante, who helped create the Renaissance. This is the year of Beethoven, or actually last year was, but we've extended it because of the pandemic. We'll have an address. My sister and my friend John Sigerson, my sister's a pianist, will be performing a Beethoven aria, their leader. And we'll have other discussions about the cultural decay and what we must do as human beings to restore, to create a Renaissance. And there cannot be a Renaissance in one nation, not anymore. We had the Christian Renaissance. We had the Islamic Renaissance with the Baghdad Caliphate. We had the Gupta Renaissance in India, and the great Confucian Renaissance in the Sung Dynasty in China. But at this moment in history, we need a Renaissance which is for all human beings, for all mankind. And it won't happen unless we bring all of these great cultures, reaching back to those moments in their culture that were great, like our American Revolutionary period, like our Abraham Lincoln, like our Roosevelt. Well, all these countries, like China, that had the nightmare of the Cultural Revolution, but is now experiencing a real Confucian Renaissance, like the Sung Dynasty under Juxi. And we have a moment in which we can bring the world together through the great cultural moments of every great culture. Nothing less than that will work, but this is the moment where it can work, because increasingly the world recognizes that we're sitting on the brink of an absolute global disaster, possible nuclear war, the Green New Deal, which literally will depopulate the world by billions, down to the level of 1 to 2 billion, which Prince Philip and Prince Charles think is the carrying capacity of our Earth.
Well, folks, you heard it from Mike Billington, and Mike Billington has been there, done that. He has paid his dues, and he is the expert at EIR and the Schiller Institute on China. So if you have questions about China, by all means, direct them to Mike. And let's make sure that we pay attention tomorrow to the conference that begins at 10 a.m. at theschillerinstitute.com. Mike Billington, I can't tell you how grateful I am for your time tonight and your expertise, and I'm going to keep studying your work and see if I can't come up with some more good questions for you the next time. I hope we'll get together again, Mike.
I hope so. Thanks very much. It's a delight to be on a show with someone like yourself.
All right. You're very kind. Everybody, thanks very much. We will talk to you soon. Good night.